such a great honor to welcome you, Maria, to this distinguished lecture of CIUHCT that we organize every year. Thank you so much for being here. It's nice to see your faces, especially today. And so I'm going to present you Maria. We have a great experience. I met her in 2015. We went to Johns Hopkins University to a conference, me, Enrique, and Antonio. So it was like our first conference together. And it was organized by you at Johns Hopkins University. It was amazing. And well, we were so well received. We met you, your family, in your house. It was amazing. And so Maria is one of the leading experts about early modern natural history. And she has made several books. One, it was more about Doers, and I wonder if you are thinking, what is this? So it's those that do things, people that take action. And then she moved a little bit, as she says, towards more to the rational and the way and the epistemological issues that were behind that action, or how to think about, to analyze that action. And so she studies, of course, she studied early modern in the Western, as she said, because she's an expert about Spain and America, so more this relationship between Iberia and its colonies in America. And she became a full professor. She did all her career at St. John Hopkins after after being an engineer at the University of Miami. So she started as an engineer, but after 12 years, she made a master in history of science, and then, of course, she fell in love with the topic and dedicated all her life to the history of science, but the early modern period. So it is such a great honor to have you here. More, she's the president of the advisory board of CIUHCT. So in fact, we have to treat her very well because the comments and everything has a direct consequence.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Maria.
Okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for the invitation. It's very kind, and Ana Martins for coordinating everything and making it happen. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here, a place that's becoming a second academic home for me, which I always appreciate. I'll jump right into my talk, which is in many ways a recapitulation of my academic career. I'm drawing examples from different facets of my scholarly work to discuss with you today. I think when you get the word emerita after your title, you're allowed to think in broader strokes than just the monograph, and that's what I hope I can do here today. And regardless of my position at the advisory board, I want questions, I want tough questions, I want pointed questions, which I'll do my best to answer, please. So I don't need to remind this audience, of course, that 16th century was a truly transformative time for all the countries at the forefront of European expansion, namely Spain and Portugal. The newness or the novedades were the order of the day during that 16th century. And true, not many people stopped to think about the consequences or to think profoundly about what these discoveries meant. And in fact, that's true today. Not everybody stops to think profoundly about new technologies or new discoveries, for example, artificial intelligence. People just use it and don't think of the implications. But luckily, back then, as there is today, there are people who do think profoundly about transformative technologies and natural philosophy. And what I want to do today is talk to you about a range of individuals that engaged with the big questions of natural philosophy and how they approach them. Over the course of my career, for better or worse, I have divided these individuals into two camps, the doers and the thinkers. It's probably the leftover of my days is a computer science, very binary, right? A 0 or a 1, or a 1 or a 0, depends how you approach it. I could have just as easily called them empiricists and philosophers, but I prefer the term doer and thinkers because it signals the objective of their endeavors, of what they were trying to do. They wanted to either get something done in the physical, tangible world, or to lay the theoretical foundations for those physical, tangible things. Am I setting up a false dichotomy and within the spectrum of thinkers? So let me spend some time further refining what I mean by these terms. And I'm using the gauge here of a car gasoline tank, right? With the doers at one end and the thinkers at one end, with no idea that I am privileging one over the other, right? Just because tank full is thinker doesn't mean that tank empty were the doers. But what do I mean by this? It's a visual aid of the degree to which practitioners engage with theoretical precepts of their disciplines, and in particular with the metaphysical underpinnings of them. So when I point to the thinkers, these are people who are profoundly thinking about what it means, what natural philosophy means, and what the metaphysical implications of it are. At the tank empty position, let's call it that, we find individuals who rarely engage with the philosophical underpinnings of natural philosophy or of science, scientia, whatever we want to call it. They generally favored mathematical approaches and actually, at least in my examples today, spend very little time thinking about the theoretical, the philosophical underpinnings of what they were trying to do. So what I'll do today is show you some examples drawn from my earlier work. And here's how I am positioning it. And we can of course discuss this. Please, it's a conceit, right, of creating this gauge. But I'm placing Andrés García de Céspedes, a royal cosmographer of the Council of Indies, way over at the doer side, followed by Juan de Herrera. And one could maybe flip this, but I'll explain why I place Juan de Herrera there. Followed, of course, by Benito, Arias, Montano, now tending towards the philosophical side, natural philosophical side. And then, for me, the quintessential metaphysician of the 16th, 17th century, the Jesuit Francisco Suárez. And I'll give you my explanations as why I'm setting it that way. So why make this arrangement? I've always approached it this way to try to understand what they understood to be the limitations but also the strengths of pre-Galilean, pre-Newtonian natural philosophy. So we're situated in the 16th century here. There's always a tension, and there are limitations, acknowledged limitations, and acknowledged strengths. And it is fascinating, and it is precisely this tension that I found again and again very fascinating, and that my historical actors always tried to resolve, or at least they make a point of addressing it. So what I want to do today is tell you what I think the implications of these concerns are. Very briefly, here's an outline of my talk. We can count it. Probably by the time we get to 3, you're going to say, oh my God, now 4 more subpoints under 3. When is she going to say finally in conclusion? But that you have to wait till 4. Okay, and I'll signal it well in advance. You can wake up and formulate your question. But before, I'm going to do take a brief moment to do a historiographical interlude. And maybe the environment of the classes is going to turn me into a professor now. I beg my colleagues, please, to excuse me. I'm going to give a little fundamental background here, which I think is important. So let me begin by saying that it's important to differentiate the role of empirical knowledge in finding explanations about the natural world from the development of empiricism as a modern, wholly formed and coherent philosophical posture. Let's place ourselves in the 16th century. That's empiricism I'm interested in and that we will discuss today. In the early modern era, empirical knowledge was gleaned from the observation of nature through sense experience, right? It was how you took in the world through your 5 senses. Most ancient natural philosophers saw empirical knowledge as first knowledge. They use that first, standing unmediated by reason. as it stood unmediated by reason, but which needed to be interpreted through a natural philosophical lens. By the 17th century, empirical knowledge became the cornerstone of the new experimental sciences. We get to the Galileo, the Bacons, and the Boyles and the Newton. Its epistemic value, having gone from being approached with suspicion, as empirical knowledge is always approached with certain suspicion, pure empirical knowledge, to being the basis of all knowledge in a new science that favored induction rather than logical demonstration as a way of arriving at explanations about nature, and where induction meant moving cautiously from particular instances to general conclusions. So this is and eventually, of course, formulating a hypothesis. Yet, before natural philosophers expressed their commitments to empiricism in the strong terms we see used with the new experimental science of the 17th century, they engaged in a long process of reevaluation of the epistemic value of empirical knowledge. And this is the story I would like to discuss today through these four individuals in a very particular place. These are Spanish individuals in Spain who are aware of each other's work and in many cases actively communicating with each other. The intellectual backdrop for them is the situation that scholastic Aristotelianism finds itself at the start of the early modern era. So let's review that first. So that was a preamble, now the second preamble. By the early modern era, doers and thinkers had to contend with what I call a very tired Aristotelian corpus, right? From Erasmus to Descartes, and to say nothing of somebody like Paracelsus, all you hear are complaints about those backward scholastic Aristotelianism. This is not teaching us anything. We're just learning how to argument about these things we already know. It's not producing new knowledge, etc., etc. Many humanists and empirics alike find things to criticize about the Aristotelian corpus. Several centuries of criticism had revealed fissures in Aristotelian and Aristotle's natural books, which medievals had been happy to point out since the Middle Era. Things like, for example, the problem with projectile motion. There were problems. Yet, despite these, they did not dissuade scholars from teaching the corpus of Aristotelian natural philosophy, particularly after it goes through Thomas Aquinas, who baptizes it, eliminates all those pagan things from it, and it becomes a teaching curriculum. Its biggest power, of course, is the argumentative power of logic when well deployed. That was hard to overlook, and scholastics were happy to apply logical tools to natural philosophical arguments. Whether that is what the historical Aristotle back there in Greece really meant or not, that's for others to discuss. But for the medievals, that's the methodology they put on top of Aristotelianism, which is why I call it scholastic Aristotelianism, or actually many people do. Scholastics claimed that Aristotle presumed that all knowledge must be derived from what was already known. So the objective of the logic was to relate anything new to pre-existing premises that were taken as unquestioned verities, truths, drawn from the common course of nature. So the premises exist, they're unquestioned, and you argue anything new based on these promises. So for Aristotelian and scholastics, a proper explanation of the natural problem involved answering the question of why, right? Causal knowledge. Finding a causal explanation was ultimately the goal, and which could be supported by unquestionable premises. These premises could be derived after a causal analysis took place, using the Aristotelian four causes, right? The final, the formal, the efficient, and the material. Or they could stand simply as a common course of nature. As the premise, heavy objects fall because they're seeking the center of the world, of the universe, right? So there is a broad range of these kinds of premises. So how did scholastics deal with empirical evidence? When we ask historical questions about the relationship between natural philosophy and empiricism, it's important to work with the definition of empiricism that an early modern actor would recognize. all right? And modern empiricism implies, the empiricism that we use today implies that a phenomenon is replicable, classifiable, quantifiable, and homogeneous. It's also taken to be ontologically real, right? Yet, the phenomena meeting this criteria can then form the basis of induction, leading to generalizations about natural laws, and so on, right? The modern underpinnings of science. In the early modern world, however, the definition was very different. Things that were bizarre, wondrous, or possibly not even real were all within the purview of empirical study, as were unique and non-replicable phenomena. An observation of a phenomenon was taken as describing a one-time event. Because it was assigned a systemic value as a discrete event, it could not be integrated into general formulations by means of inductions and eventually become a premise. There is the circle doesn't go one way, it only goes in one direction. They stood as data points, should we say, if you pardon the anachronism, as entries in an encyclopedia or as many searches that come up in a Google search, right? They're discrete bits of information. Even for thinkers who trusted sensorial impressions, such as Thomas Aquinas, experimental knowledge could never be the basis for natural philosophical formulations. He explained that the eyes, and I quote the saint, the eyes, ears, and hands provided the mind with reliable pictures of the world, even though universal knowledge shapes and gives meaning to sensory expression, right? It has to go through that philosophical lens. What he's saying is quite simply that what the senses tell us about the world needed to be interpreted before it can become universal knowledge. Thus was the relationship then between natural philosophy and empirical knowledge, in a nutshell, at the start of the 16th century. By the end of the following century, so scant 100, 150 years later, empirical knowledge would have claimed and earned a place as a cornerstone of what we recognize today as modern science. So how did this happen? The first step was the gradual disenchantment with the Aristotelian natural philosophy I mentioned earlier. My investigation into the Spanish response to the flood of information arriving from the New World shows that for the most part, the process of experimental or experiential recreation involved describing, cataloging, and understanding this empirical knowledge, and that it coexisted comfortably with the paradigms of Aristotelian natural philosophy. It rarely required a naturalist, a physician, or a cosmographer to venture into the field of philosophical speculation. Naturalists and many astronomers used empirical observation as an epistemological tool that facilitated compiling useful information about nature. And here, the usefulness is an important word. So for the most part, this activity did not entail formulating new natural philosophical postulates or challenging existing ones. This does not mean that the work of empiricist naturalists or physician was simplistic or self-evident. Rather, it was incredibly careful and aimed at creating systems of classification that helped organize a world where there was too much to know. I call these people the doers. Yet, for natural philosophers, the situation was entirely different. Empirical knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, had to be interpreted and related to universal principles, not just simply described in catalogs, as I simplify the doers are doing. In what follows, I'd like to explore the contours of an attitude toward prevailing natural philosophical systems that I've referred to as the Spanish disquiet. And I've defined it as a preoccupation with the ability and validity of prevailing natural philosophical systems to explain the natural world. The Spanish disquiet, it's Spanish because those are my examples, not because it's unique to Spain, okay? I'm not claiming it as any kind of nationalistic anything, because why would I do that for Spain? But it also extended to the purely empirical and theory-free understanding of nature that gained momentum in Spain during the century of discovery and was seen by some as philosophically unsound and potentially morally dangerous. So people starting to make conclusions on empirical knowledge without a proper foundation in natural philosophy, which, as you will see later, was uniquely tied with the tenets of the Catholic faith, was seen as problematic and potentially very dangerous. So how is this resolved, right? Now we have a tension that is also profoundly theological as well, although I won't go into much of that today. So having set up this problem, let's take a look at our examples. In my example, as I'll remind you where I had put it. I had put Andrés García de Céspedes very, very much in the doer camp. He was the Spanish Council of Indies found in him a very uniquely qualified cosmographer and a very hardworking problem solver for the empire. The capacity of work of Andrés García de Céspedes is unbelievable, what he achieves in just a brief 10-year period. He's the son of hidalgos. He entered the clergy after university study, and he only got as high as licenciado, which is an interesting, if we can make some conclusions of that. He spent time at the castle in Burgos while the fortress had a cannon foundry. In 1582-83, he came to Lisbon at the service of Archduke Albert when the king's nephew served as a viceroy of Portugal. While at Lisbon, he mentions discussing astronomical navigation and cartography and with Portuguese pilots and studying the works of Pedro Nunes. After 1596, once named royal cosmographer of the Council of Indies, he spearheaded the reform of the Padrón Real, the master navigation charge for oceanic navigation, and he published what became the definitive navigation manual of the Casa de la Contratación. So he does produce tremendous amount of work for the empire. He wrote a number of technological works. He only published two, this one and a small book in mathematical instruments, but he left accounts of having written about latitude on theoretical and practical perspective, on the theory and construction of astrolabes and the Jacob staff, on sundials, on mechanics, on theories of machines, and he also listed having written two manuscripts on planetary theory, according to the theories of Copernicus and Ptolemy, as well as a commentary of Auerbach's planetary theory. So from this list of works, it is clear that Céspedes was most interested in astronomy, and it's curious because it's precisely as an astronomer that he tries to get the attention of Philip II. By 1993, he was in charge of maintaining the clocks at the royal palaces. That goes beyond winding them. It was much more sophisticated than that. And he writes a proposal to the king. Unfortunately, it only survives as an 18th century copy of a memorandum, not the original treatise. But he's promising to build all these wonderful large-scale instruments to be placed at the Escorial, at those wonderful terraces, south-facing terraces of the Escorial, so that the Alphonsine tables could be rewritten and corrected. Céspedes makes a point of saying that he has made observations and again found that the tables are wrong. We need a large astronomical observatory. Had it been built, of course, it might have rivaled Tycho Brahe's Uraniborg or something like that. But it doesn't go anywhere. And part of it is because he gets named Royal Cosmographer of the Council of Indies and becomes very, very busy there. So to get at Céspedes' attitude about empirical knowledge, he writes, let me first tell you, no natural philosophical treatise. This is not a man that's interested in apparently interested in metaphysics or even cosmology. And he does engage with Copernicus, as I mentioned earlier, in a purely instrumentalist way. So of course, this lack of natural philosophical treatise is why I place him as a doer, as an empiricist. He was responsible for offering solutions to real-world problems, and his goal was to attain a measure of predictability and perhaps control over nature. This presented a problem to the more thoughtful empiricist. Understanding particulars might account for a given instance, but it might not prove as a convincing experience when applied to other cases. And what Céspedes tells us again and again is that what he wants to do, and I'm citing it in Spanish, is dar regla. Create rules about how nature worked. And better yet, if the predictive power of mathematics and geometry could be brought to bear. As Céspedes explained, he had shown all the mathematical proofs necessary for the art of navigation because, as I quote, he who makes the rules has the obligation of making them accurate and just. On other subjects, such as the deviation of the compass needle due to magnetic declination, he's not quite sure what the philosophy is behind that. So he tells us, I quote, although some have sought to create rules about the deviation of the needle from north because, as we will explain later, this is an uncertain thing. Here I am simply giving you reports and not creating any rules, right? He doesn't have that philosophical certainty or the empirical evidence to create a mathematical rule, so he will not speculate, right? He doesn't want to venture there. So the observation of the phenomenon, in his view, was left to stand on its own rather than accommodated to a particular natural philosophical interpretive scheme. Thus, for this very, very busy man, whose image we don't have, so I give you the cover of his book. I could have found a generic 16th century priest, but we don't know. The empiricist approach of collecting, organizing, and making sense of natural knowledge was often accompanied by a very pragmatic and utilitarian attitude. So for pragmatists like Céspedes, the criteria of truth lay in the merit of the practical outcome of a conceived notion rather than on its metaphysical underpinnings or of the theoretical explanation. Mathematics proved a valuable tool for modeling those aspects of nature that not readily apparent to the senses. So what the senses couldn't perceive, mathematics could go that little bit further. But he never ventures, at least in what survives of his work, beyond into philosophical explanations. So the next person that I place on our gauge, moving towards thinker, surprisingly is Juan de Herrera. I don't doubt many people would have placed him in the doer category more than that trending farther away. He's best known as an architect, a builder, a very pragmatic man. He also acted as the king's personal advisor on cosmographical matters. He's the son of impoverished hidalgos, and like many proud nobles of reduced means, his future lay in a career of arms. He joins the personal guard of the Prince Philip at the time and would travel Europe with the young prince as he went about recognizing his father's possessions. It was really an educational grand tour for the young Juan de Herrera. By 1563, he's working as an assistant and draftsman to Philip's architect, Juan Bautista de Toledo, who himself has apprenticed under Michelangelo. So after the Juan Bautista's death in 1567, Herrera becomes the de facto architect of many royal projects, including, of course, his most famous one, which is the monastery palace of El Escorial. Throughout his life, we know that Herrera is very interested in cosmographical questions. In 1573, he requested and was granted a royal license to sell some navigational instruments he had invented and claimed determined not just latitude but also longitude. We're very curious about that, but we don't have any surviving drawings of it. Between 1581 and 83, he accompanied Philip II to Portugal. That was quite an educational trip for Spanish doers, where alongside the king, they famously inspected Portuguese navigation charts and says, they're all wrong. Well, were they really? But while in Portugal, Herrera recognized that persons with required mathematical skills were rare in 16th century Spain. And he resolved definitely to remedy this situation. He became the driving force behind the Royal Mathematics Academy in Madrid, perhaps modeled or definitely inspired by the Portuguese Aula da Esfera. His mission was to prepare young men to practice professions based on mathematics. So Herrera's approach was to tailor a course of study to suit the demands of particular professions and produce men useful, prácticos, right, useful for the empire. He conceived of mathematics as the foundation of all sciences, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but definitely in things like arithmetic, geometry, for preparing students to become surveyors, mechanics, astronomers, experts in nomics, cosmographers, pilots, experts in perspective and optics, musicians, architect, painter, etc. All things, careers of people who do, right? Who produce a practical object. Throughout his life, and by the way, the mathematics does get established. It's not just left as a perspective. For those of you who don't know, it becomes established. It exists on its own for about 20 years in Madrid and then gets subsumed into the Jesuit college in Madrid. Throughout his life, Herrera was willing to take on technical challenges, often going beyond his immediate expertise. I mentioned although he trained under an architect, he's largely self-taught. One of his manuscripts, this Arquitectura y Machinas, he's talking about how cranes work. And it's his sentence structure is horrific. He probably should have gone to university and learned. But quite clearly, he has read classical treatises on the subject, the pseudo-Aristotelian mechanical problems, and he's attempting to model this treatise. After it, halfway through the treatise, you realize that it's going to be dedicated to the king, and it's meant to explain how cranes, large cranes, work. At the time, of course, the Escorial is under construction, and he's trying to give those explanations. This type of practical analysis served Herrera's technical problems very well, founded as they were in the theory of the lever, geometry, and an Aristotelian understanding of the fall of heavy objects. Curious to know that that's all you needed to know to build something like the Escorial, right? No need for CAD or for great laboratories that study strength of materials. One could say that it's over-designed, but it is, I think, a testament to what of course could be achieved without modern tools. Yet what's curious about Herrera, and I think what places him further on that dial, is another treatise that he writes later on. He took his love of mechanics and geometry in a very unexpected direction. Or was it really unexpected, given the Spanish disquiet? And let me get into that. For him, mathematics also prepared the mind for learning not only about the material world, but about the spiritual world as well. As Herrera's stature grew, he also collaborated with humanists at courts to assemble a world-class library at the Escorial, and in parallel, he assembled an impressive scientific and technical library for himself. But it is telling that 1/4 of his collection are books on the Lullian art. He's a lifelong follower of Catalan philosopher Raymond Lull, who has more names, Raimundo Lulio, Raimund Lull, but it's Lull, 2 L's and 2 L's all the way. Herrera obeyed and believed fervently on the principal tenet of Lullist philosophy that maintained that all knowledge comes from a single art. The Lullist art, in addition to serving as the organizing principle of all knowledge, as Lull maintained, also functioned as a method of spiritual contemplation. In his best-known mathematical writing, Herrera brings together Euclidean principles of the cubic figure with Lullian metaphysics. So what is he doing in the Gran Discurso de la Figura Cúbica? The first part of the treatise, he develops lengthy proofs on Euclidean geometry about the cube and how you can use the cube to perform certain mathematical operations. That's straight out of Euclid. In the second part, however, it gets very interesting because he proves, or he attempts to prove, that everything in nature is made on the basis of a cube, right? The most infinitesimal to the human body, it's all based on this three-dimensional form of the cubic. And he says something interesting there, and how cubic operations are the means by which entities are applied to beings in order to create them. So what does he mean by this business of applying entities to beings? We can take a deep dive into medieval metaphysics, but let me jump to what he's actually getting at. He's no metaphysician, I might add. What he wants to do is relate the 9 Lullian universal and absolute principles against this language of principles, which Lull defined, as you see here, goodness, greatness, duration, power, wisdom, will, and virtue. And Herrera wants to make these the foundational premises of nature. So how he goes about this, Lull in another treatise says, there is a 3-dimensional relationship that correlates these. He calls them longitudinal, latitudinal, and profunditudinal. So Herrera's proposition is that these map, right, to the 3 Aristotelian functions of active, passives, and mixtures, and that this Lullian cube, which explains not just all of philosophy, all of moral philosophy, also explains the physical world, right? And they correlate not one-on-one, but operationally to the Aristotelian accidents, right? And that this Lullian cubic form also supports accidents or Aristotelian predicates, is another word for it, the Lullian principles being the basis of the Aristotelian ones. So what he has said is now all of this Aristotelian natural philosophy is really based on the Lullian great art. What he has done in this treatise, in my opinion, is relate Lullian principles to Aristotelian accidents, not by establishing one-on-one correspondences, but showing that they operate similarly through the cubic relationship among the terms, and thus ontologically grounding all accidents of nature in Lullian philosophy, right? He's subsuming Aristotle to what Lull is trying to do. An important move. Philip II, his patron, was also an avid follower of Lull. So in my mind, Herrera resolved the tension between empirical knowledge and natural philosophical by finding that the Lullian philosophy as the foundation of Aristotelian natural philosophy. As with Céspedes, mathematics proved very useful, but in this case, as a way of linking the empirical world, natural philosophy, and Lullian metaphysics. Right? This is the work that he's trying to do. And he's very proud of this treatise, which is almost impossible to read. Rather than discard the existing epistemic and ontological apparatus of scholastic Aristotelianism, Herrera chose instead to put it on top of a Lullian scaffolding. Why would he do this? Why would he do this? This way, and here I venture into the realm of speculation, he retained the search for causality as the ultimate objective of the natural philosophical enterprise. A causality that's not lay, it's not purely natural philosophical, but through Lull's precepts ties directly to the divine presence in nature, right? He's also worried, right, by that original pagan origin of Aristotle, and he connects it not as Aquinas has done, but as Lull would have, through the Lullian predicates, as a way of addressing his concern. My next example is Benito Arias Montano, a fascinating figure still considered one of the towering figures of European humanism. His life trajectory and intellectual development prepared him not just to edit the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, but also to attempt an ambitious and little-known reform of how humanity approached the study of nature. For me, in Arias Montano, you really, that's why my book is titled The Spanish Disquiet, you really see this concern with what are the senses saying and how are we going to reconcile it with a truly pious natural philosophy. Right? Not something adopted from the likes of Aristotle. He was well aware of what a cohesive natural philosophical system entailed and developed epistemic approaches and methodological tools that allowed him to formulate not only a new metaphysics, but a cosmology, a physics, and a natural history. He does the whole panorama. He didn't live long enough to write the book on the human being, but he tried. This is indeed on conventional ideas and a novel natural philosophical works that he called his magnum opus, right, his great work. He saw this even more than his theological treatises, of which he wrote many. This he considered his great work. So what's he trying to do? He's trying to create a new natural philosophy derived from first principles that were unquestionable. And these are not Aristotelian. What is unquestionable in an early modern mind? The Word of God. So he turns to the Bible and says, I'm going to find them there. Or he thinks he's going to find them there. And we'll get to that in a minute. But these are some important premises of Arias Montano's work. He only saw three things as valid sources of knowledge upon which you could create a new natural philosophical project. What are they? The divine revelation. You can have a moment of divine revelation from God. Who had this? Well, Adam, Moses, and a few others. Second, the Word of God is revealed in the Bible, right? God spoke to Moses, and he wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible. That is certain knowledge. We know this for sure. And what's the other thing he knows for sure? Empirical knowledge, the world as we see it. It's not lying to us. It's there. What we don't know is how to interpret it, is his point. So how does he go about this? He cleans the slate, right? Tabula rasa. Where do we stand? Where are we going to start? And where he's going to start is at the moment of creation, and proceed chronologically from there. There are 5 core premises to his work, and I'll just go very briefly over them. One is, what is the purpose of humanity? The only reason we're here on earth is to know God. Everything else is a distraction. Our purpose is to know God. His second premise is the belief that Adam, before the fall, when he's happy with Eve and the Garden of Eden, enjoyed complete knowledge of nature. That's why he lived in a state of no fear. There was nothing in nature he didn't understand and he didn't know about. But of course, after the fall, this knowledge gets lost. So how do we revive it? How do we find it? Well, in what he believed to be the language of Adam, which was Hebrew. Hebrew, as it's written in the Bible, encodes this knowledge of nature. It could be recovered, he argues, if you could decipher the arcane language of the Bible. Arias Montano's third premises concern the immutability of the order and genus of all things created by nature. He's no evolutionist, right? There's no Darwinian evolution here. God created the world as it was in the time of Adam, and what we see today is exactly what Adam saw. If you don't have that premise, this whole system doesn't work. And he makes that point very clearly. Fourth, why is the world? Why is there a natural world? Why aren't we just disembodied spirits? No, God created the world for the benefit of man. He never says women. Sorry. In my book, I use the word humanity, which was trying to be politically correct, but it's quite clear this for the benefit of man. Probably that's a use for a woman in his mind too. But so therefore, finding a thing's essential nature also meant identifying its utility for mankind. And his final premise, this one, an epistemological issue informed by historical circumstances, concerned the role of sense perception in his program. His belief was that human sense perception was a diminished human capacity, helpful for living in this world. God gave us sense perception so we wouldn't be bumping into things. But since it was intrinsically flawed, it could not be the sole source of knowledge. Right? He wouldn't have gotten along very well with Francis Bacon. But so he believes, it's a useful tool, but it doesn't get us all the way there. So how does he go about this? I can give you 500 pages of it, but let's just look at how he starts, which is precisely at the very beginning of the Bible. One thing he does very interesting in the Antwerp Polyglot is insert a translation of the Hebrew Bible made by Santes Pagnino. And what he does in that is play fast and loose with the semantics of the Bible, something that was, of course, highly criticized because it's the Vulgate, right? That's the official Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible, not Pagnino. But what Arias Montano does in his exercise of translating Pagnino is start to clarify things in a way that you see where his natural philosophy is going to go, which takes him 20 years to write it, but you see it early on. Suffice to say that in he translates in principio creavit Deus caelum et terram and so on. He translated to mean that the space above the waters, the abyss, now contained matter in the form of some sort of a cloudy substance, and this matter was operated upon, continually agitated by the Spirit of God, or Elohim, right? So this is not the turbulent, almost unorganized heaven that is suggested perhaps by St. Jerome's Vulgate. It's a world that is very much in the process of making. So what does he then discover from this? He comes up with his metaphysical principles. Remember, he knows a proper philosophy starts with metaphysics, so that's where he takes us. So he uses the Hebrew terms, and I apologize for my horrific Hebrew. I have to practice it very much to pronounce it halfway intelligibly, but I've given you the original there. Causa, right, which he spells in capital letters like that, is the first cause of everything. It simply stands for the goodness of God implied in the act of creation. And it comes from the Hebrew word rashith, or in the beginning. This is God being merciful to man. Only God existed before the second principle happens. The second principle is iehi, or fiat, or erit, or the word of God, the verbum Dei. Montano explains that it is the creating force in nature, a word that when used in relation to God gives perpetuity to form and constancy to things. It encompasses all and brings forth everything, cares for everything and protects it, but it's in one remove from God. The third principle is Elohim, right? A divine force that is vigilant, present, and extends over everything and encompasses everything. Elohim is in this room. It is operating. It is the life force. It makes things grow. It is the operating agent in nature. Elohim imparts motion unto lesser spirits to determine favorable moments for when things are going to appear, when a seed is going to germinate, increase, when things are going to die, which results in all the actions needed for generation, decay, and regeneration. The fourth principle, ma'im, is a liquid with a dual nature, a form of matter capable of creating anything. Montano noted that the sacred text uses a Latin word aqua to describe ma'im, which was not entirely accurate in his opinion because of the etymology of the word in Hebrew suggests things of a double nature. The ending in M suggests that it has a double nature. The Hebrew mem means that. So ma'im becomes in Montano's exegesis a liquid with a double nature. One is fertile, sweet, somewhat flexible. It can flow anywhere and not condense. It resembles milk or an oil. It is greasy, pingue, and can catch fire, and is akin to sulfur. The other liquid is humid, salty, salsum. It can penetrate and fill voids, be subject to hot and cold, and can condense. It hates fire and is akin to mercury. So all corporeal things, in his view, are made of mixtures of these two liquids in a proper proportion. And if this reminds you of alchemical science of the early modern era, very clearly this is exactly where he's taking it from. He was all his life very interested in alchemy, surrounded by alchemists, and drops many clues of his interest in alchemy throughout the history of nature. So what he's done is created a theory that dispenses with the 4 Aristotelian elements and the ether. There's no need for that. There's just mime. At first glance, it appears as if as a novel formulation, but upon further examination, and if you think about what this is actually doing, the work he makes it do, it is fundamentally Aristotelian, right? What is causa? The final cause. What is Elohim? What is Ea? The formal cause. He gives forms to everything. He uses that word. What is Elohim? It's the efficient cause, the agitation, the things that makes things happen. And what is Ma'im? The material cause. So, while dismissing the causal system of the peripatetics, which he despises Aristotle and all the pagan philosophers, he still needed their functional equivalent to be able to explain how forms and species come into being. He looked at Genesis and found, what do you know, but the four Aristotelian principles there. In my estimation, Arias Montano's strength were his keen observation of nature. His history of nature spends pages and pages even describing snails and plants and animals, and he's definitely a student of the natural world. He has a profound curiosity about the principles underlying natural philosophy and a healthy skepticism of ancient philosophies, and in particular Aristotelian authors. And yet, he was not able to escape them. His biblical approach to natural philosophy led him into the tangled philological path in search for first principles. This deep dive into Hebrew gets him in all sorts of problems. He has to write defense after defense after defense, which he does quite convincingly. But he's never able to disengage from what was understood to be the proper natural philosophy. What was proper natural philosophy, which was a science based on first principles. We do not know if he recognized how much his biblical philosophy owed scholastic Aristotelianism. It's very clear that he has gotten this almost in a moment of revelation, and that this is how things stand. What's interesting is that his closest 2 disciples, Pedro de Valencia and José de Sigüenzas, whenever they're asked about this book, they say, I just read Arias Montano and I don't understand anything. What's he doing here? They explain everything in Aristotelian terms, right? And that's the language of translation, which probably made Arias Montano turn on his grave. But they say, even my closest disciples didn't get it. Or maybe I don't get it. I don't know. But again, it's this preoccupation that just observing nature is not enough, just doing things, the metaphysical foundations have to be there. And then very quickly, because one can talk so much about this extraordinary man, Francisco Suárez is our final example, the eminent and pious scholastic professor at most major Iberian universities. When I was writing this list, Salamanca, Valladolid, Segovia, Ávila, Colegio Romano, Alcalá, Coimbra, I figured that's more jobs than a modern-day postdoc, or close to it. But at least he didn't have to worry where his next job was going to come from. His goal, what is his goal? To establish Aristotelian natural philosophy. He doesn't want to throw that out on a metaphysical foundation that was in concert with reality as experienced through the senses. So the primary preoccupation of the metaphysical disputations is reconciling those 2 aspects of philosophy. And why do that? It was to point this metaphysics towards a theology that led to a better understanding of God, and a better understanding of God as understood as the creator of this natural world. So bringing a sense perception, the reality of nature in concert theologically with metaphysical precepts. Like Arias Montano and Herrera, his perspective offered the proper point of departure for interpreting natural world. In putting it forward, he also was responding to what he saw as a dangerous misinterpretation of the Aristotelian corpus, or radical departures from it. That was just as bad. He complains about the Italian naturalism. People like Talesio just says, let's just look at nature, that's all we need to understand. He says, if we separate the study of nature from the ultimate purpose of man, which is to understand God, we've lost our way. And that's what he tries to correct. Understanding metaphysics for him was to be the starting point of philosophical program. In the metaphysical disputations, he's creating a program of study that, although modeled in the commentary tradition, some have argued it's the style of a modern philosophical treatise. And under the format of it is also very difficult to read, is are radical reformulations of Aristotelian natural philosophy. And I'll just synthesize those in a paragraph by saying that Suárez proposed restricting metaphysics to the study of real beings, both finite and infinite, and who have a real essence, not a real presence, but a real essence, privileging the efficient and material causes over the formal, while always keeping God as the final cause, right? But it's not the final cause of the thing, it's the final cause of the world, right? And denying a real distinction between essence and existence. I won't go into that. He was a systematic thinker, well aware of the limitations, but the importance of Aristotelian natural philosophy to theology. By this time, the two are intertwined, used to create convincing arguments about the real presence in the host and the wine of the Catholic Mass. He defends the substantial form and final causes, and showed an inclination toward grounding natural philosophy in real causes and real things. He uses common experience as supporting evidence for most of these changes in an effort to bring scholastic Aristotelianism in line with empiricism that characterized his era. In hindsight, perhaps we can say that Suárez's greatest limitation was that he was not willing to, as we say in colloquial English, burn down the house, right? He doesn't get rid of a scholastic argumentation or of the metaphysical principles, but navigates it very carefully by rebalancing some as more present than others. It was read widely, these books, the Metaphysical Disputations, was read widely by Catholics and Protestants alike, and influenced, as some have argued, the works of Descartes and Leibniz. So whereas his successors in the 17th century, will deny the existence of substantial forms and say that's just an Aristotelian obfuscation, and even say there's really no final causes. Perhaps there is a God, but he doesn't dictate what happens on earth. Suárez defended them, arguing causality stemmed from divine intentionality, and substantial forms explain situations where no other explanations were possible. You can see he's painting it closer and closer to the corner to explain what's unexplainable, but it's still very much there. A pure and convinced thinker, which I'm happy to place at the very end of my dial. So we've reviewed four persons. They're four extraordinary individuals, without doubt. Whether doers or thinkers, or if you don't believe that, if you don't buy into my categorization, that's fine too. But all of them recognize that the scientific paradigms at their disposal left many questions still unanswered. So in closing, I have argued elsewhere that Spain's scientific enterprise wrestled with fundamentally the same philosophical concerns that drove the development of science elsewhere in Europe. There's by no means exceptional. But by having tested the bounds of empiricism early on and having identified its shortcomings, sought perhaps longer than most. It's an effort that persists longer when most have abandoned, of course, these Aristotelian formulations. They persist in Spain. They sought a cohesive and comprehensive natural philosophy through which to interpret the natural world, and where God was front and center, right? This theological preoccupation is the one thing that can't be put aside. So God and nature are tied inexorably together. each to the other. So this not turn Aristotelian natural philosophy into a legitimate and virtuous pursuit by countering the threat posed by systemless quest into the secrets of nature. And there are tremendous problems by people that go study, they perceive it and prosecute it. People go into the study of the natural world without understanding what is its purpose, what is its cause. So purely empiricist approaches harbored perils that separated humanity from God and could potentially undermine the religious truths upon which Christianity was based. The stakes were very high, as Herrera, Arias, Montano, and Suárez felt. Where does that leave somebody like García de Céspedes? For him, the certainty of mathematical proofs and an instrumentalist approach to astronomy sufficed. It was highly productive and without having to engage in these deeper philosophical questions. Or maybe we don't know that he did. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I found the tension between thinkers and doers, or more specifically between doers searching for theoretical underpinnings and thinkers trying to get something done, quite fascinating. And why so? Tensions always beg for resolutions. Exploring how 16th century practitioners of science dealt with it and the solutions they proposed crystallized for me just how fast the edifice of Aristotelian natural philosophy was crumbling and how pressing finding solutions was. Particularly for thinkers, and as far as for doers, it also revealed how intentional a practitioner of science could be in sidestepping Aristotelian scholastic edifice in order to continue finding solutions of problems arising in the real intangible world, things concerning navigation, things concerning building very big buildings, and so on. I imagine this tension of all these actors that I've discussed today as people balancing on a tightrope that was about to break. And that's what I got when I went to Deep AI and I asked them to show me a medieval scholar walking on a tightrope. I could have done better with cut and paste. But that's their understanding of it. Why he's over the Alps, I'm not quite sure. But so I'll finish my talk here. I welcome your questions. I know I've covered a lot of very specialized material, but I'll be happy to engage and answer your questions for as much time as we might have left. Thank you. We'll leave Arias Montano on the tightrope for our conversation. Preguntas.
So who wants to start with questions? Well,
first, let me tell you thanks
so much
for this wonderful talk, stimulating talk, and very nice and very clear and really great. Great to have you back in this. And
Thank you.
Of course, there's many questions I would like to ask. I will start with one that perhaps allows you to expand a bit on some ideas you had when you designed this opposition between doers and thinkers. So, first question, just about the 4 persons you showed us. They are all writers, aren't they? So they publish. They have things in common.
They except for Herrera, who only published the institution of the Mathematical Academy. That's all he ever published. He left his mark in big buildings, but definitely Arias, Montano, and Suárez are writers.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I would include the manuscripts.
Sure, of course.
Too. So about writing about the cube, cubic problem, etc. That would count for me. So they can be grouped they form a group among themselves. So my question is twofold. On the one hand, what do you think about other groups? who are not writers, like artisans or merchants, administrators, and their way of thinking about things or doing things, on the one hand side. And then, on the other hand, these four, how would they think, if they had to describe themselves, or if they had to, would they recognize differences among them? You know, so would they perhaps, they wouldn't say doers or thinkers, but I mean, are there hints or evidence that they somehow see themselves more on the doer side?
More on the thinker side. I'll take the second part of your question later, because there's a lot to reflect on that. For the first part of your question, it's of course very difficult to understand what people who don't sit down to write, let's call them a scientific treatise, really thought, right? They operate in the real world, and they have tools to make them function here. With perhaps, if we're going to reach for, let's call them metaphysical side things, it would be religion. It would be faith in the belief in another being that somehow gives order to everything, and that's as far as metaphysical reflections of people that are not perhaps trained in this kind of scholastic or way would have thought about the world. So very much the real world, and then an understanding of God. The problem, the perception, of course, is that if you spend too much time paying attention to the real world, you might not be paying attention to God or understanding how it's all put together, which is, after all, a proof of the testament of God, ultimately, right? He's created us, and that's why there must be a God. So it's hard to get to that. In fact, even with somebody like Céspedes, who is university trained and academic, it's what surprises me is how intentional he is in not going there. He wants to dar regla. He wants to give the mathematical equation, draw the map, give the rules, and that's it, and not go into the philosophical part of it. It's almost unless we find something new, something he wants to avoid completely. Now, for the other three, where are they of each other? They're roughly contemporaries, with Suárez being a little later, but certainly Herrera and Arias Montano know each other. Arias Montano is no fan of Lulian philosophy. He thinks that is an added layer. Why do we need that layer when we can go to the Bible and the first 3 verses get the fundamenta of nature, right? All law has done is obfuscate things somewhat. But the project is not dissimilar in its very fundamental way of trying to situate a philosophy of nature that is ultimately leads to a better understanding of how the divine presence works in the world. And of course, for somebody like Francisco Suárez, he is profoundly aware of what theological disagreements can do, right? He is involved in the Grazia controversies in Rome. He's asked to come in and attempt to resolve that, which, if that even gets resolved, we're not quite sure. So he knows that if the principles are not well understood, ultimately the edifice of faith, of religion, needless to say, of the church can collapse. And what's fascinating is that he seeks to resolve it by going into metaphysical principles and favoring the real, right? And leaving, reframing the final cause as God, and the substantial forms as for the unexplained. If we can explain it, we don't need this strange thing called a substantial form, right? But he leaves space for all of that because, in the second part of the story, is because of the theological importance that Aristotelian framework has. So they are never in conversation with each other about their philosophical problems or natural philosophical approaches. But the fact that they all three attempt it suggests to me that they're responding to something, to a particular preoccupation. So yes, it's a somewhat ad hoc selection of historical actors, but I'm also trying to make them do a particular kind of work I want them to do. I want to show that there is this preoccupation, and I think they all approach it through a different angle that helps you think about it, which is ultimately what we try to do as historians. When they don't tell us, we want to get closer. Sure.
What strikes me is the quest for the arcane knowledge that you showed us of Arias Montano.
Yeah.
I was thinking of Copernicus resorting to the Pythagoreans to lend credence to his mother, and also of Newton as the priest of nature.
Absolutely.
So Newton saw himself as the one that was capable of discerning the arcane knowledge. Would you say that this is a shared belief in the early modern period? Would you say this is a driving force of empiricism?
You know, it's a tradition that we can start pinpointing. That, of course, it's long-standing, but it catches more relevance in 16th century humanist circles, because with the return to the ancient languages, Hebrew is one of those languages. But with this very particular thing that Hebrew has, which is it is considered a sacred, precious language by Jews. So they are meticulous in transcribing the Bible, right? They are religious about it. In every period, every dot, every character has to be perfect, has to be a complete replicate of the previous one, and so on. And for the earlier modern audience, this logically extends back to when Moses wrote it. So it's as close as you can get to the original source, and there is a tradition, right, of the original knowledge, prisca sapientia. Is it that of the Platonists? Ficino and the Platonist is one strand of that, right? One way of getting to original knowledge, but really smelly of pagan, right? There's you don't know who that theurge is, or that demiurge is really. Is it really our God, or is it somebody else? So the Hebrew and the Hebrew language is a certain path, right? The chronology, the genealogy is correct, which is why it's so attractive to somebody like Newton, who would pay attention. He's so convinced about it, he doesn't have to explain it, and yet his scientific efforts towards proving the chronology of the empire, of the religious faith is like, okay, you doubt it, I'm going to show you mathematically how this all lays out. So no, it's not uncommon during the time. As we historians of science well recognize, it's an aspect of Newton that was obscured for the longest of time, because it's unexpected if we imagine Newton to be a modern natural philosopher. But he's not. He's a man of his time, and he has this religious preoccupation that really occupies a significant amount of his writing. I forget what the amount is.
1,000,000 words.
1,000,000 words in the subject of biblical chronology. So no, these were not small preoccupations.
The other writings.
Yeah, the other writings, right? The ones nobody bid for in the auctions. Yeah, yeah. I hope I got to an answer there, or did I go down a strange path? It's close. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I also have a question if there is anyone else.
I mean, it's really, really fast.
Yes.
No.
You refer to people who, in a way, there's some overlap, but in a way, there's also differing areas of study and areas of interest.
Mm-hmm.
And you arrange them on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
You find in the early modern Spanish context that the discipline in which they operate, using that with quotation marks,
Sure.
is it all predictive of their stance?
Oh.
I expect so.
I guess the most unexpected. I'll give you an answer in that all the three works that I select. I'm leaving the Céspedes aside, but in Herrera, Arias, Montano, and Suárez, those would be those. In Herrera, it's completely unexpected to have this treatise on the Lulu's figure. the bulk of his work, architectural plans and so on. In Arias Montano, he writes far many more biblical commentaries that he does a history of nature. In fact, the history of nature is a very unexpected work from him, especially unexpected. He calls it his biggest work, his biggest contribution to humanity is this book. And for Suárez, he writes also many more biblical commentaries that he does, the metaphysical disputations, which is a work he begins writing while he's still very young, and doesn't and publish it much later. But he also considered it particularly important. So these excursions into are not necessarily representative of the bulk of the work these individuals do.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Maria, is there any other question? Okay, so Maria, I have one.
Sure.
Why do you use, because in this kind of, this is in fact also a little connected with epistemology.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you use the word doers and not practitioners?
Practitioners, yeah.
Which is more common in this.
You know, when I've used practitioners, I've used it in the context of trying not to say scientist, because of course there was no such thing. So I use practitioners of science. But I like the word doers because it signals what the objective of the individual is. And when you look at that dial, Céspedes and Herrera are builders. Their main work is to produce something that is going to be useful in this world, not in the spiritual world, not in another world. And Céspedes wants a navigation manual, so they don't sink ships, right? And they know how to properly navigate to the world. Herrera wants to build buildings. So it more reflects what the ultimate objective of their life's endeavors are. And of course, for Francisco Suárez is metaphysics. It's all a life of the mind and of the spirit.
As then the opposite are the thinkers, they could be the natural philosophers.
Sure.
Because here we could also argue that these guys that do, they have much more hands-on knowledge.
Mm-hmm,
but they also think, because then they also write.
Yes, but they're not thinking philosophically. They're not thinking about what are the underlying necessarily metaphysical principles of anything. It should almost be about maybe the scale should be metaphysicians at one end and empiricists at the other. Maybe that's a better classification, but that's not very catchy, right? So, and I can't pronounce metaphysicians very well. So doers and thinkers work. You know, it's a shorthand, and there's no. Let me put it this way. I wasn't trying to create a label and a scale. It's a way of organizing the work of four individuals and showing what their fundamental preoccupation is about explaining the natural world. Sure.
Okay, so is there any other questions?
Very well. If some of you want to come up later. Oh, yeah, please.
Yes, I have a curiosity
Sure.
about this distinction, doers and thinkers. I was wondering whether there is any social pattern crossing this difference. For instance, thinkers were more aristocrats and doers were rather more people coming from lower strata, sort of straight up.
You know, I would put all four individuals in similar social categories. They are not particularly well-born at all. It's hard to find a thinker that was of that in that era. So they're all people who, in many ways, earn their merits by their talents and skills. They're well positioned socially. They're hijos Hidalgo. Arias Montano has a hard time proving that, and he gets the right paperwork eventually because he was always suspected of having been a converso from a converso family. But that gets settled. But they're all either university educated or get the equivalent of a university education, like Herrera does with his apprenticeship. And they are of course, close to the court, which increases the visibility and gives them or with the religious circles, gives them the, let's put it this way, the intellectual space to write things like that. You don't write the Discurso de la Figura Cúbica if you're so busy, full of reports, and you haven't, This is a meditation, almost a religious meditation. And of course, Arias, Montano, and Suárez are religious members who are, Arias Montano in the case, very much in the graces of Philip II, who underwrites his projects, and Francisco Suárez is a Jesuit, so somebody else takes care of that. So of the Hidalgo class, let's call it that, but not very rich Hidalgos. Arias Montano ends up being quite wealthy, but not the others.
Thank you, Maria.
Slightly connected to that, would you say that doers were more in need of finding proper patrons, or?
Definitely.
The other ones were Jesuits. Less so.
Less so, but just looking at García de Céspedes, his one published book that he publishes before he's in the service of the Council of Indies, the book gets printed because it's dedicated to the the nephew of Philip II. But the beginning of the book reads like, oh, look at all my other treatises. If I could only find a patron to pay for these, I could do wonderful things. What's amazing is that so many of them actually do survive, that the manuscripts are there. I think we're missing the or fractions of the planetary theory one. Of course, the good parts are not there, but definitely somebody like him would have been looking for patron, but he gets it. He gets the job. The job in Spain to be able to do this. Okay. Very well.
Yes, there is no other question. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Good. Very well. I hope we all learned something new today.